Hello, this is Todd Luck, and did you know that the same actor who played Johnny Rico in Starship Troopers also played Tarzan? Would you like to know more? And unfortunately, there's no point during this movie where Tarzan says, "Come on, you apes, you want to live forever?" I'm sorry. That is my last Starship Trooper joke. I promise I've gotten that out of my system. And so I actually had a question from a viewer about what I thought about this movie, and I couldn't remember. I saw it back in the theaters in 1998, but my memory was kind of fuzzy about like what my actual reaction was, so I decided to go ahead, just buy it and do a review. And so we'll be talking about the movie, we'll be talking about where it fits in with Tarzan's history, and also where it fits in with Casper Van Dien's career. He plays Tarzan, and this came out just 4.5 months after the movie that would define his career. And so I couldn't find this movie on any streaming service. It did come out on both VHS and DVD back in the day. And so this is the cover. And by the way, these are just shadows over Tarzan. At first I thought this was like war paint or something. It's just kind of weird shadows. And so this is what it looks like. And it is actually a clasp case. It's not a traditional DVD case. You have to open it up like this. And then when you open it up, you actually have a listing of the scenes in the movie. This was actually pretty common on early DVDs because the innovation of DVDs was that you could select different scenes to watch on a menu. And so oftentimes they would list them like this. It's like, you know, tracks on an album or something. So I thought that was kind of cool. So a lot of people don't know this movie existed or have forgotten about it. And surprisingly, it had a lot going for it. The movie is actually shot in South Africa, which is just like Tarzan the Epic Adventures, except since it's a movie, they get to have better cameras and they get to actually go on these really exotic and beautiful locations. And it's just a nice looking movie. There are a lot of sets that were built for the movie, and those look pretty good too. And the Opar throne room I thought was very, very nicely designed. Even though we only see it for a couple minutes, it looks really badass. And just like Tarzan the Epic Adventures, they use South African actors and extras for the natives. And the natives here are portrayed heroically. Most of them are trying to protect the lost city of Opar, and they are portrayed with dignity. They're Tarzan's friends, though there is one who's a little grumpy that he left for Europe. They do get to take part in the action, and there's even a giant fight scene with hundreds of people in it where they get to attack the army of mercenaries who are trying to get to Opar. And it's pretty epic, even though it only lasts maybe a minute or two. And there are real animals in the movie, and it's not a lot, but it's enough to let you know that the jungle is filled with all kinds of different types of life. Tarzan gets to ride an elephant. Tarzan and Jane get to ride an elephant together. And so it's wonderful all that's in the movie. Of course, it does create its challenges. Casper Van Dien actually got bitten by a chimpanzee and almost got gored by a baby elephant, though he did make it through with only minor injuries during the filming. And there was a lot of challenges as far as the rain and flooding and storms go. And so another positive for the movie is the portrayal of Tarzan. So right off the bat, we know that he is John Clayton, Lord Greystoke, and he's a reasonably intelligent person who can speak proper English, but that's just the baseline. That's just a bare minimum of a decent Tarzan portrayal. The movie takes a while to get going, but roughly around halfway through, you're going to start seeing references to the novels. He actually tells Jane that he taught himself to read using the books in his father's cabin, which just blew my mind that that was a reference in a movie. And then there's a scene where he uses his rope to pull one of the bad guys into the trees and finish him off there. And it was just like right out of the novels. I thought that was so cool. The look of the character is definitely mixed for the first half, but man, once they get him into that loincloth for the last half, you know, when you combine it with the weapons, it's just absolutely perfect. Probably the best looking traditional version of Tarzan I've seen as far as costume goes. However, the hair to me looks a little bit funny. They used hair extensions on Casper Van Dien, and I just don't think his hair looks that great. However, the rest of him looks amazing as Tarzan. But to me, the highlight of the movie is Jane. And so it's a little bit of a different Jane from the novels as far as her background goes. Just like Greystoke, she's an English brunette who meets Tarzan after he goes to England. And so The first scene with her was a bit concerning because Tarzan gets this kind of mystical summons to come back to Africa to stop a threat there. And Jane just throws a fit because this means they have to postpone their wedding, and she calls it off and all of this. But then Jane goes to Africa in an outfit remarkably like the one that she'll be wearing in the Disney movie. And so she reunites with Tarzan, and she comes to understand who he is on this deeper level. And so her subplot is her falling in love with who Tarzan really is and where he comes from. And it's kind of an interesting twist on the novels where Tarzan's love of Jane brings him from the jungle to civilization. Here it's Jane's love of Tarzan that brings her from civilization to the jungle. And at times that plot line is done very well, but the highlight to me is that Jane is also involved with the action and goes through all the different things that you see her do in the novels. She runs from the bad guys, she outwits the bad guys, she shoots a gun at the bad guys. It's Jane with a gun on screen, which is just freaking awesome. And so while it's fantastic it's shot in Africa and that Tarzan and Jane are inspired by the novels, unfortunately that is the only thing they used from the novels. Mugambi is in here, but he's a completely different character. He's a shaman who is Tarzan's friend. And then Opar is in here, but Opar in name only, nothing to do with the novels. If you want to see a great adaptation of Opar from the novels, look up Tarzan the Epic Adventures on Tubi and watch the episode Tarzan and the Priestess of Opar, which in my opinion is the best thing that's ever been done on the screen with Tarzan. However, I think what they came up with could have worked. So it's this bad guy named Nigel Ravens and this group of mercenaries who are after the lost city of Opar. And Opar here is the world's first civilization. And it's reimagined here as this kind of mystical African civilization that seems to have been the inspiration for all other civilizations in the world. And so it is a mix of jungle adventure and light supernatural elements and could have potentially been a good Tarzan story. However, no part of how this movie was made makes any sense at all. And so one of its problems is it's a PG rated movie. And so if you're making an action movie aimed at younger and older audiences, that would be PG-13. If you're making a PG movie, that movie is aimed solely at children. And that is a very odd way to narrowcast your audience for a movie like this. And plus, unless you're Lucasfilm, it's almost impossible to make a good action movie with a PG rating in the late 90s. So the first half of the movie is very kiddie down, very watered down stuff, but once you get to the last half, they do start doing some scenes that do feel like real action movie stuff, even though they're very brief. But even then, they're usually kind of choppy and cut up in order to get that PG rating. There's one scene where a bad guy's about to get Jane, and so Tarzan throws a knife at him to take him out. And this is a very standard scene for a Tarzan story or an action movie, right? However, unfortunately, because of the rating, all they're able to show is Tarzan beginning to motion to throw the knife, and then we cut to Jane's face as she reacts to the knife hitting him and says, "Oh." And that's it. That's all we got to see. It's super awkward. And then there's what it does to the dialogue. If you've ever watched an R-rated movie that's been aired on network TV, you'll know that they'll dub over the curse words with stuff that's usually nonsense and turn, perfectly good dialogue into something that's awful and cheesy. Well, that's how they had to shoot some of those scenes in this movie. They actually had them say the stupid stuff instead of cursing. So there is one scene where dynamite lands in front of a bad guy and he knows he's about to die and he says, "Oh, shoot," which is, exactly what I think we would all say if we were about to get blown up, right? And then there's a scene towards the end where the bad guy, Nigel Ravens, believes that Tarzan is dead, and then he hears the Tarzan yell, and he turns around and says, "What the heck was that?" Yeah, this is a guy who's been murdering people throughout this movie, but cursing, oh no, he wouldn't do that. The $20 million budget for this movie just wasn't enough to make a good action movie back in the late 90s. And it's only 83 minutes long, which is unimaginably short for this type of movie. So it just really didn't have time to do much of anything. I think those factors alone would probably make it almost impossible for it to have been a great movie. But unfortunately, the way it's executed is just such a mixed bag. The performances are sometimes good, sometimes they're not. The effects, vary as well. And just the way it's cut together at times is just incoherent. Sometimes that's a scene where you're just not seeing everything you should to understand what's going on. For instance, when the bad guys get to Opar, one of them yells out that it's a trap and they all start shooting, and like one of them throws dynamite and stuff. But we have no idea why. We never see what that dude was reacting to, what they're shooting at. It's just so confusing. Who knows what was going on? And it really does feel like things are just missing out of the movie. There's no context as to what exactly Opar is. And, kids are probably going to be okay with that. And, they can use their imagination to fill in. And honestly, I think this is a great movie for kids. But unfortunately, I just don't feel like they meant to leave that as open-ended as they did and have such a small anticlimactic battle at Opar at the end of the movie, especially since they'd already done this giant battle with hundreds of combatants just probably 20 minutes before then. And I feel like there almost had to be some scenes missing to establish the bad guy's motive, because at the end of the movie, he suddenly, right at the end, just a few minutes left, says that he was secretly after this magical thing in Opar that's never mentioned in the movie up until the last couple minutes. And we don't have any definition of what it is or why it does what it does. I have no idea. And so obviously what was released was a very flawed movie, and the way it was distributed was also mystifying, because it must have received almost no marketing or distribution because it only made $2 million and it was never released internationally. But that's not a unique problem to this movie, because Warner Brothers also did not release Greystoke internationally, which is unimaginable. So oftentimes when things go wrong when a movie is made, there are post-mortem articles or documentaries about it. That's not the case here. All we can do is speculate. What I would say is probably it's safe to assume the studio abandoned the movie and didn't like it, and that's why the distribution and marketing was so bad for it. And it's entirely possible that the studio was hostile to it even before then. That may be the reason for the budget. That may be the reason for the mystifying, kidding down nature of it. I suspect it was probably a movie that was conceived of under very different circumstances than it was made. And so to give some historical context, the last Tarzan movie to come out was Greystoke. And that started out as this passion project by someone who wanted to do this super faithful adaptation of Tarzan and the Apes. He wrote half the script, but then he had to sell it, and someone else made the movie, and they decided to do something else entirely with the last half of the movie. And by the time you got to the end, it did not resemble Tarzan in the slightest. And instead of being an action adventure movie that could start a franchise, it was this one-off artsy tragic drama that won awards and stuff, but it was just not something you could build a franchise off of. And there was some Tarzan merchandise that was released at the time. It did not have any labeling for the movie at all. It was just generic Tarzan stuff. But unfortunately, none of that really caught on. I mean, I didn't even hear about it, and I was in the target audience for Tarzan because I was a child at the time. But when I did hear about Tarzan was in the 90s, and that was the big Tarzan push of the 90s. And so in the mid-90s, you had a TV series, you had toys, you had novel reprints, you had painted Joe Jusko cards, you had Dark Horse comics, and so there was a lot of momentum, there was a lot of hope for this franchise, and in the middle of that, there were two movies being developed. One was an animated movie by Disney, which of course would come out after this movie came out in 1999 and would be a huge hit. And then the other movie was a live action movie that presumably became Tarzan and the Lost City. However, by the time they were shooting Tarzan and the Lost City, all of that had dried up. The show, the toy line, all of it had been canceled. And the only thing left were comics from Dark Horse. And unfortunately, the comic industry had crashed, and the only way you could get comics were in the remaining comic shops. And so there was just no presence of Tarzan in the mainstream anymore. So even though there was no hype around Tarzan by the time this movie was released, there could have been hype around Casper Van Dien. Now, there is a quote from a producer that claims that they watched his performance in Starship Troopers and that's why he was cast in Tarzan. Considering these two movies came out only 4 months apart, I kind of doubt that, but I do think that he was probably cast with the idea that if Starship Troopers was a hit and it was supposed to be this big blockbuster, that it would elevate Tarzan. Unfortunately, that did not happen. Starship Troopers did not make up its budget and was considered a box office bomb. And so, unfortunately, Casper Van Dien's career just never took off. And so Casper Van Dien never became a huge movie star. He certainly had his roles over the years, but things he headlined just didn't make a lot of money. For instance, Dracula 3000. But he was still very well known and very well loved for starring in Starship Troopers, which did make a lot of money, even though it didn't make up its budget. It was #1 movie in the country when it launched. And so a lot of people did see it, and a lot of people remembered him in that role. And so Starship Troopers would launch its own franchise, just not on the big screen. And so there was a CG animated series on TV that had some excellent writing. And then there were direct-to-DVD movies, and Casper Van Dien would return as Johnny Rico for the third one, Starship Troopers 3 Marauder. And then in more recent years, there have been Starship Troopers CG animated movies, and these have really gorgeous animation in them. And he would return as Johnny Rico, doing the voice for that character in these movies. And I personally love the Starship Trooper franchise. It's this story of this kind of militarized fascist Earth fighting these alien bugs that are trying to destroy humanity. And it's dark, it's satirical, it's just really good. And it's all of the different iterations of it, whether it's the big screen movie or the home video releases or the show or whatever, they all have a very consistent feel to them, and they're all Starship Troopers. So I definitely wish for Casper Van Dien this had turned out to be better, but I think it probably still has a special place in his heart, because I know during the interviews at the time, he would say that he wasn't able to show his child Starship Troopers because it was rated R, but he could watch this movie with them and they could see Dad as Tarzan, which is pretty darn cool. And I think he may even have some affection for it now, because I watched a recent interview with him and it was at his home, and in the background you could see some fan art of him as Tarzan with Gal Gadot's Wonder Woman. So I thought that was really cool. As far as if I would recommend this movie, I mean, back in the 90s, I would have been like, well, it's not the perfect movie, but it's the closest thing we've got to the novels. However, since then, obviously, we've had Disney Tarzan, which used novels to create its own version, which was fantastic, and Legend of Tarzan, which tries to do everything this movie did, but does it really well in a really amazing movie that, in my opinion, is the best Tarzan movie ever made. So yeah, there's a lot better stuff out there, but this is still worth picking up as a piece of history, and it's cheap if you want to check it out. I think it's probably a good movie for kids, and there's definitely some scenes in here that I thought were well done, and some scenes in here I would definitely love to see in a modern Tarzan movie. Jane with a gun, the natives having a giant fight against the bad guys. I'd love to see that in the next Tarzan movie. All right, that's it. Like and subscribe for more videos, and until next time, see ya.